Hey Internet, I wanted to make another video in my composition and production series talking about different pieces I've written and how they came together and how I produced it. This week we're talking about the main theme for a survival horror game that I did. Quick intro, the developer wanted something very similar to Dead Space and the score that Jason Graves wrote for it. So this is a traditional orchestra with a lot of extended techniques. I also added some electronic elements in it as well, but it's all about dissonance and texture and and rhythm. Very little of it is melodic, almost none of it is melodic. So it's all about blending all of these textures and having things ebb and flow and create something that's interesting and that moves forward. So I'll play it, then I'll talk about it, and here we go. Then it fades away to nothing. Okay, so again, dissonance, ominous, threat, all things that to me just scream tritone. Tritones got to be something important in this thing. So that's how I started this. I began with some string tremolos here, as you can see, and I've got two different patches. Well, they're the same patch, just two iterations of it, and they're hitting similarly shaped chords and stacking them on top of one another. So the way I started this off is I had E and B flat for the first voice here. Sorry about the siren outside. You can see that. So E, B flat, which is a tritone, and then I add a major second above the bottom note. And then I take the same exact shape and I just move it down so it's built off of C. So I've got F sharp and C, and then D. If you were to stack all of that stuff together, you've got C, D, E, F sharp, and I guess it would be A sharp. To be theory textbook. like correct. So it's kind of similar to a cluster, just a lot of stuff together. If you try and make a traditional chord out of it, I guess you would maybe call it an A sharp or B flat augmented sus 2 and 4. That's a bit complicated and weird. Just throw a bunch of whole steps in there, similar to a whole tone scale. The reason why I have all of this automation there is because the tremolo sample itself only lasted for so long, and you could hear different voices dropping out around this area. So I just have them offset, so when one is dropping out, the other is strong, and then they just trade off back and forth, so it sounds like a consistent texture. Beneath them I have sustained notes of the same chords. I have them there to create another way of drawing attention away from the fact that some of these samples are ending and don't sound exactly the way that I want them to. These sustained notes here create kind of like an audio bed that helps to mask kind of the errors that are here. So between the volume automation and the sustained notes, I hope it sounded as if it was just one violin section with a series of Divisi tremolos going the entire time, and that you didn't notice that there were just sustained notes below. That was my goal. From there, this just continues. We've got some bassoons with some extended techniques that come in if we listen to this. Just a really weird, ominous texture there. So much of this piece is all about the volume automation and modulation with your MIDI data. Let's see, did I do it here? I didn't do it here, I just modulated the volume there. But an example of the MIDI data modulation being incredibly important is in the brass here. So if you listen to this, again, this is another Extended Techniques Orchestral Brass Effects patch. I think this one is Symphobia, if I'm correct. Yeah, that's Symphobia. But as you see, look at the modulation. That changes the timbre of the sample that we're hearing a lot. And that combined with the volume automation makes this huge swell, especially when we've got it in more than one instrument, as you see here. But this on its own sounds like this. Just ugly and awesome. One thing I want to bring attention to is the fact that I overlap the MIDI notes here. It would sound weird if they suddenly cut off and there wasn't kind of bleeding over one another. Lots of times with the MIDI data you need to make it imperfect in order to make it sound realistic. So that's what's going on there. And again, there's not really any theory or anything behind these. A lot of it is experimenting and checking the different options that are available in patches. So like here, and I can change the modulation there. And I just experimented and found one that went with the chord that I had created in the strings. But this whole piece is just about creating this texture. The first time that we actually have kind of a release of all this tension is when we have that wave and swell in the brass. At the same time, I have this patch of rise and hit going. I mean, that just sounds great, and combined with everything else. Couldn't hear everything else that came in there, but I want to endorse rise and hit so much. It's one of my go-tos for kind of rounding the corner in phrases and transitions. It's got a lot of different categories of sound types: traditional orchestral, synthesizer, sound effects, but the whole idea is that if you play any note in the lower register of your keyboard, you get the entire sample here. Oops, and there we go. While if you play anything in the higher register of the keyboard, you get just from the impact and the tail of it. It's great, it's fantastic, it's one of my go-tos. Check it out if you're looking for something to fill that purpose. But this piece just essentially turns into an evolving textures to keep it interesting. I eventually add some violin taps here, just some random pizzicatos, where you're just slapping your fingers on the fingerboard there, getting that sound. And yeah, I then begin to add electronic elements such as this. I then add this cymbal, which feels weird because it's obviously processed and seems out of place, which puts you as a listener a little off balance again. And then as we keep going, we get to here. I add this layer, and then add this layer as well. Talking about these two layers very quickly, this one, something about it just felt like like it had an element of finality to it. It seemed like something had to happen significantly at this point. Up till now, I had been adding all these layers of textures, and it had been moving, and other things had been getting quieter while other things came in, but it was all still there. And it wasn't until I added this texture that I said, all right, something very drastic and different has to happen now. So after this point, we have this swell of this kind of human breath before this huge, massive hit comes. You'll only be able to hear so many instruments because of the MIDI data, but here we go. Bram. And here's that Bram. So yeah, that's just a huge, massive impact. At the same time, I have damage coming in, which is like my favorite industrial, ultra compressed, very punchy drum library. And I've just sequenced a couple of different loops in it to give it its own phrase. Here, listening to it on its own, it sounds like this. And it does that over and over again. I also loved that kind of distorted vocal sound effect at the end of this. It really stands out too because a lot of other instruments kind of die off, especially that Bram, as you see, dies off. Maybe it has a tail that lasts for a little bit till here, but then when you hear that vocal, it's right here and it's on display on its own. It's really important and it's really cool. And essentially, I just do the same thing again. Here, I had a texture that started out with tremolo violins creating that dissonant chord. I added other orchestral elements. I then added other electronic elements. And then it swelled, and I just started in on a new texture. And here again, I'm essentially just building and adding elements to it again. Really similar to Stravinsky in the way that he likes to compose. Not that I'm comparing myself to Stravinsky, I'm not, trust me. But he did that a lot too, where he would have musical material and then add layers, and then kind of drop so many of them out, or start a new section with very little musical content and add layers and add layers and add layers. And that's essentially what we're doing here. We've got the drums. After a while, a lot of these elements come back in again with some other additives as well. One thing I want to bring attention to is this. Well, here, let me back up. The second part, when I bring in the violins, I've got a very different rhythm going with them as opposed to the straight, 4/4 time that I have in all of the other instruments. So even though we've got 4/4 time, one thing I want to draw attention to is the velocity and how important it is for this, because that's what makes it interesting. So even though we've got 16th notes, I'm accenting every third 16th note. All the while in the cello part, I'm accenting right on the beat. So combining these two together creates a very interesting texture. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was a tritone. What is it? C and F sharp tritone. But that kind of disjointed rhythm or polyrhythm of putting one on top of each other, along with having this synth down here, essentially kind of like a dubstep element to it, if you listen to it. I'm just using that to accent that 3/16th note rhythm that I have going in the higher violins, just to give it a bit more bite and crunch and make it that much more powerful and stand out. In the grand scheme of things, it sounds like this. You'll hear the difference if I take away that synth element. It just doesn't have the punch or distortion or power that it gets when you add that synth to it. In addition, I want to talk about, is it this? No, I want to talk about this. So this section right here, so you can hear there's not a lot going on and it never really grabs your attention, but I want you to hear how different it is with and without this. Without this, you've lost kind of a sense of depth and a chunkiness to it that you get by adding this percussion to it. Let's hear it with at first. All right, and now let's listen to it taken out. It's subtle, but it adds this depth to it, and again, chunkiness that I think if you do enough of those little things in a track, that it all adds up to having a noticeable and favorable effect on it. So that's why I wanted to talk about that real quick. I mean, listen to it without it at that point. You can hear it just sneaking in the background and kind of giving this idea of like a wall or a space that you're in that you don't get without it. So that's why it's in there. I'm then adding layers, I'm adding octaves. I'm not doing a whole lot in terms of like really music theory for this part, but it all leads up to another swell similar to what I had in this area towards the beginning. So it builds, everything drops out, and then we have a very similar build to the beginning. In fact, these may be copied and pasted. They're copied and pasted and slightly altered and edited to help give it a little bit of a different texture there at the end when it fades out. But that's really how the whole piece comes together. Again, not a whole lot in terms of composition or not in terms of theory, but just always thinking about generating interest and forward motion with this. So let's get into the production of it. First off, I have this dark texture that is playing while I have violins and bassoons and all of this stuff. And this really helps to make kind of a audio or a musical bed to this section of the piece. Here. And it also comes in at the same time as the bassoons, so you don't really notice it. Just fades in with the bassoons. Now it's kind of there in the background, but you hear how bassy it is. But I've got so much cut away that most of the other instruments are living in this area and it's not conflicting with them. For the strings, I've got high tremolos, so we've got a high pass filter that's cutting a lot of frequency content there. Same one for the other violins that I have. The sustained violins, again, that are creating that bed that I don't want your attention drawn to, they're out of the way from the higher register violins, at least a little bit. And then I'm also taking out a lot of their low end, so they're not competing with the dark texture or the bassoons that are there. Next instrument, bassoons. I don't even know if I did much DQ these. Oh, I actually did a lot. Moved them out of the way of the violins here, gave them some serious bass, and I even applied a phaser to them. Wow. Okay, so these sound weird. I guess I can hear that phaser. Cool. But yeah, making them live there, making sure they're not interfering with the tremolo violins in this area. And just the bassoon itself, while it has bass frequencies, it doesn't have so much that it was competing with the texture up here. Brass, this depends on the specific patches that I was using. Here I have it living in mids area and taking out high end, while here I have it existing in the high end, so those aren't competing with each other. And then this I have living a bit lower in the frequency spectrum, and again taking out the highs. So that combined with their different panning, this is towards the left, this is towards the right, this is the center, they are competing with each other while playing. The Bram, the important parts of it are the low end and the high end, and I want it to be out of the way for everything else, which mostly lives in the middle here. So that's why I have it EQ'd the way that I do, and why I have it compressed. Let's listen to this compressed, and then we'll listen to it uncompressed. Do you hear that punch? Now let's listen to it uncompressed. It loses all that punch and a lot of the grittiness from the distortion. I actually try and avoid compressing things as much as possible, so that when I apply compression, it has an extra punch to the element that I apply it to. And this Bram, I really wanted to have some real impact, so I used compression for it. Rise and hit. The cymbals are important, the low end's important. I don't want it to get in the way of most other things in the center, so that's why it's EQ'd the way that is. The violin taps, it's percussive, it's quick. If it's interfering with anything, it's quickly out of the way, so I didn't feel the need to EQ it. And the strings towards the end, let's see. Violin high, rolling a little bit off the top so it doesn't sound too tinny, but then it lives in the highs. Then this moves a little further down, that moves even further down. And then we've got bass, which has a low pass filter on it. So you can see how I arranged this like a traditional orchestra. Violins are all the way to the left, or first violins. Second violins, which are probably going to be a bit lower, are just a little to the left. Viola, violin, second violin slash viola. Cello is off to the right, and you can see the way that I have it EQ'd here. It's still got a lot more in the lower areas of the frequency spectrum, but it is rolling off the top. And then because it's rolling off the bottom, it's not interfering at all with the bass, which is living all in this area down here. From there, we've got damage. It's taking a little out of the low end so that it's out of the way for the bram to have that real huge body to it. That's what I felt was more important. I didn't want the drums to have that low body because they're there the whole time and would make the bram have that much less impact and weight to it. So I chose to let the bram live in the lower area of the frequency spectrum there. And because they don't interfere, the punch and kind of smack of the drums for damage cuts through more, and they actually work together better and have more impact because they sound separate as opposed to if they were conflicting with each other. Human breath, I wanted some high frequency content for that to get that sound, so that's why that EQ's there. Electronic effects, you can see how I have these EQ'd. So I mean, let's listen to what this is. So you can see why I wanted to get the higher end of that. The low end is going to be conflicting with other things and isn't the most important part of that sound. And for this, kind of the exact opposite. You can hear how there's so much higher distortion, grittiness that comes through. I mean, this is far more of a rhythmic thing as opposed to really a timbral thing. But it doesn't have much bass in it, while this one does. It's got a lower end body, so these two aren't conflicting with each other too much. And I even got them panned a little bit of ways from each other, so again, making sure they don't conflict. And for this, the dubstep, I guess, element, that grittiness from the distortion and that bite from it lived in this area, so I just gave it a little boost so it comes out even more, as opposed to, hear how that sounds a little muffled, and it just has more bite and punch and grabs you a bit more with that boost there. But yeah, this was based off of a traditional orchestra at first, so I've got my violins to the left, cellos to the right. Departing from that, I have the bass in the center. It just feels odd if you have bass all the way off to the right for most tracks. And then from there, I would just try and place all the other sound design-y and or electronic elements so that they wouldn't conflict with the different elements of the orchestra. So if I had something with a lot of high frequency content and it was an electronic element, I would pan it to the right because there's less chance of it conflicting with the cello, because the cello lives lower in the frequency spectrum. If I had a lower bass synth or something that had lower frequency content, I would pan it to the left because less chance of it conflicting with the violins. And that's essentially how I approached this. Just send everything through a healthy amount of reverb sends as well. A couple different ones depending on how much verb I wanted to give things, but in general, that's how this piece came together. I hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions or if there are any types of music that you maybe want to have me look at and dissect. Maybe I've worked on something that's in the vein of what you're asking for. But either way, let me know if you have any questions, comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks, bye.